It is 11 o'clock, and we are here for Farming Today, an online agricultural conference brought to you by the St. Cloud Area Chamber of Commerce and lots of wonderful sponsors. So we do want to recognize a couple of those sponsors right now before we go into our next breakout rooms. Thank you to Steffes Group and Arnzen Construction and St. Rosa Lumber for their sponsorship. And let's hear from very briefly hear from a couple of our sponsors.
No matter how you buy ag equipment, AgDirect can finance it. We're powered by Farm Credit, people who know agriculture. So along with options to purchase, lease, or refinance, AgDirect offers attractive rates, helpful service, and ag-friendly terms. When you compare the price of iron, be sure to compare your cost of money. Ask for AgDirect. Built for agriculture, powered by Farm Credit.
AgDirect is built from the ground up to finance ag equipment exclusively. More than offering attractive rates, we offer ag-friendly financing options, experience, knowledge, and service. It's easy to understand why AgDirect is among the fastest-growing farm equipment financing brands in the nation. Whether you buy equipment from a dealer, at an auction, or a private party, choose AgDirect to finance it. AgDirect.com. Franklin Outdoor Advertising. Why choose outdoor? Continuous message. Outdoor advertising provides consistent exposure 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Lowest cost. Outdoor advertising guarantees a lower cost per thousand than any other media. While outdoor CPMs are about $1, CPMs for all other forms of media are much higher. Reach and frequency. The consistency delivered by outdoor advertising means a higher percentage of the target audience reached and a greater number of exposure opportunities as well. Flexibility. Advances in technology allow for frequent creative changes to all outdoor media formats, including posters, rotary bulletins, and permanent bulletins. Franklin Outdoor Advertising.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Betty. I'm Bernie Quist, a member of the Farming Today Conference Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Betty Burning, who is going to talk to us today about dairy's future supply and demand. Betty is a principal consultant and market analyst with the Daily Dairy Report, get it in the right order, Daily Dairy Report, and Betty Burning's Consulting. Welcome, Betty. We look forward to your message.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to bring my presentation up. I'm in my magical drum room. This is my husband's room, and I joke this is the only room in the house that has a door that actually locks. So it's a wonderful room to make presentations in. Let's see, can you all see that? Yes, I got a thumbs up. Okay, yeah, and we'll do some things in the chat today too. If you have questions, please, fill them in. Bernie's going to be monitoring the chat, but it would be great to try to make this as interactive as possible over Zoom. So today I'll be talking about long-term global dairy outlook, and my first question is, who are you? Who's watching the presentation today? So in the chat, just put in your name, your farm size, or your profession if you're not a farmer, and what it is you'd like to learn today. And while you're typing that into the chat, Bernie gave my a little bit about what I do. So this is the farm. I actually grew up on a dairy farm in central Minnesota. That's a picture of the farm, and then my background is in agricultural economics. I've worked across the ag and food supply chain. I worked for AgStar when I was first out of school. I know Bernie a little bit from that. Now your comp here eons ago, right? And then I went back to school. I got my master's degree from Penn State, and then wound up working for General Mills, primarily in their dairy sourcing team for a number of years. When I had the first little guy, this little guy here, I wound up moving into extension and worked there for a few years. And then my third one did me in, and I started working for myself, doing Betty Burning Consulting, and I write 1 to 2 days a week for the Daily Dairy Report. I threw a picture of them in, though. They're my 3 lively sons, and that's actually on the farm that I grew up on as well. That's a rare moment when they're not running around. Hence why I'm in the drum room with soundproofing today, because we don't need 3 small people pounding. All right, I do see One person in the chat, Chris. Okay, milk price direction. Oh, that's always a popular question. Maren was supposed to talk about that. Come on now. I'll try to touch on that at the end. Okay, so with that, like I shared, I write for Daily Dairy Report 1 to 2 days per week. Maybe some of you subscribe to that. When I worked for AgStar, that's actually when I learned about Daily Dairy Report. So I've been reading it for a long time, and then at General Mills, we were subscribers too. But what I like about the publication is we cover such a wide variety of topics. If it's a USDA report day, we'll talk about what happened with milk production. But if it's not a USDA report day, it could be all sorts of different things. Could be sustainability, consumer trends, what's going on in the marketplace. It's a quick short read. It's just $115 per year. And I like that we really try hard to give you like the so what. So what does it mean if pizza consumption is up or restaurant traffic is down? So if you are not a subscriber for less than $1 a day, you can be. And I don't know, I love writing for them. And I would say all of us that write are very passionate about the dairy.
Could you transfer me?
Oh, Bernie, do you know how to do that? I think someone wants to be in a different room. I think you go to leave room and go back to the main room. Is that right?
Yes, in the lower right, there should be a leave room.
Okay. So with that, we'll get started with the presentation. So today, here are the 3 things that I want to talk about. Number 1, what is milk production going to do in the future? Where is it going to grow? Number 2, what markets are going to grow? And then number 3, what does that mean for dairy farmers here in central Minnesota? And with that, we'll just jump right to it. So in the chat, if you like, you can fill in, what are your thoughts on future dairy production? And when I say future dairy production, I'm talking like 10 or 20 years in the future, not just 2022, especially here in the United States. And what do you view as threats? So I'll give you a minute. I'm trying to look at the chat while I'm talking too, but please feel free to fill in any thoughts that you might have, and I'll try to incorporate or talk about it towards the end. And then the other question for the chat at this time, does anybody know, and I will watch the chat, which country in the world produces the most milk? I think Bernie might know.
I'll hold up.
Hold off. She's super full. India, thank you. Yes. Is it India? It is India. Very good. Yeah, and that in India, it's not just cow's milk. They milk other things there, buffalo milk. But yes, it is India. That's right. And that's actually in the future where most of the growth in the dairy industry is expected in terms of production, where it's expected to grow. So I'm going to start kind of with a global view, and then I'll talk a little bit more about India. I will give you a spoiler right now. They're going to drink all the milk that they make. So we'll talk about some of the other places where milk growth is, where they will actually export the excess milk. So, the obvious is that milk production is going to continue to grow, and that will be, due to genetics and great management, just like we've had in the past. The International Farm Comparison Network expects milk production growth to increase by 2.1% from now until 2030, and then slow to 1.7% growth. So it's going to grow. It just might grow a little slower. And that reason for a downtick in growth really is dictated likely by environmental policies, animal welfare, land limitations. We're going to talk more about that in another slide. And then just competition for land too with other ag sectors. It was interesting doing research for this presentation. What I found, if you look, you can look at lots of different sources to figure out where milk production growth is going, and it'll vary. So OECD, FAO, for example, expects milk production growth globally to grow at a rate of 1.6% between now and 2030. Your takeaway, I would say, is it's going to grow. It's going to continue to grow. milk production. And we'll talk about the demand side of things and where everything nets out in a little bit here. So getting back to India, of this growth in milk production, half of it is expected to happen in India and Pakistan. However, these countries are really rapidly growing. 30% of the world's population will be there in the not so distant future. So therefore, they're going to consume everything that these increases will be used domestically. India actually is expected to surpass China in terms of population in the next few years here. World Economic Forum expects that to happen in 2026. So it's coming, and all the milk there is going to go, right, stay in country. All right, so that's great. They're gonna grow, but they're gonna consume it. So who cares, right? You might be thinking that. What about these major dairy exporters? So we have three major dairy exporters. We have the United States, we have Europe, and then New Zealand. Your takeaway here is the U.S. will continue to grow, and they have the most potential. Here in the U.S., we have the most potential for growth. We have the land and we have the water. Yes, there are restrictions, particularly in the West, more environmental restrictions, and the desert, you know, Utah, Arizona, there's some limitations there in terms of water. But if you think about the Midwest, where we are here in Minnesota, we have water, we have land, we can grow our own feed. So the U.S. is actually really well poised to grow. And even without growing cow numbers, I heard is pretty large right now here in the U.S., at least when you look over the last 20 years or so. Production will grow too. So in 2018, the USDA said, you know, average cow gives about 23,000 pounds per year. They forecast that that's going to increase by 5,000 pounds, so close to 28,000 pounds per cow by 2040. And, you know, to me, that's really remarkable, because you would think like we're nearing this limitation of how much milk a cow can give. But yeah, due to genetics and herd management and other management practices, just on the basis of milk per cow, we're going to continue to see growth. And then we have the land, we have the water here in the States to continue to increase milk production. So what about Europe and New Zealand? They probably will continue to grow, but they're limited. So in getting ready for this presentation, I did a little more research on New Zealand. I knew it was small. It is about the size of Colorado. It's 100,000 square miles. It's a little bigger than Minnesota. Minnesota is about 87,000 square miles. So just think about that, like, and they graze. They are really limited in land. And then the geography is such that they can't really support growing row crops. So you could make the argument, well, they'll just switch to confinement style dairying. Yeah, they absolutely could do that, but they're gonna have to import crops or something in order to be able to do that. So, well, they might continue to grow kind of through these genetic gains and things. At a certain point, they're going to run out of land, and they're going to run into just environmental restrictions as well. And then in Europe, we have some of the same issues. So Europe is kind of interesting. It's a blend of both grazing and feed-based systems, but countries like Ireland are almost exclusively grazing. And again, you run into the problem of you can't grow more Ireland, right? It's not going to get any bigger. So they're limited. In addition to that, in Europe, there's just more environmental policies and more competition for the space. So they're somewhat limited too in how much they can really grow their dairy industry. So that means that I personally think here in the US, we're really in a good spot to continue to grow relative to some of these other countries that are key exporters. So then, or my mind went as I thought of kind of parse through these things, like where's most of the growth going to happen, and what's going on with exporting countries. Like it's March Madness, right? So like, who are the Cinderella stories? What are the wild cards, right? So these are kind of the wild card areas on the next slide. South American and Chinese production are expected to grow as well. I'll talk about South America really quick, and then probably what most of you are wondering about is China, what's going on in China, because there are just so many people there and it's growing so rapidly. In South America, Brazil is the largest producer of milk. They make about 55 billion pounds of milk each year. That was the 2020 number. But they're actually net importers of dairy products. So, and they have been for, I don't know, like the last 10 years. there are, what's the population of Brazil? 211 million people. So likely they will continue to be a net importer even if they grow. Okay, so the two countries in South America that really participate in the export market, and in a very limited way, by the way, are Argentina and Uruguay. Argentina produced around 25 billion pounds of milk in 2020. They have land, they have water, but government policy may greatly limit how much they can grow. It's just a different culture down there. Uruguay, though, Uruguay actually has a lot of potential to grow. The trouble with Uruguay is that it's pretty small. So in 2020, they produced about 5 billion pounds of milk. And if this helps put it, so Brazil was 55 billion pounds net importer, Argentina was 25 billion pounds, some exporting, and Uruguay is 5 billion. The US was 220 billion pounds last year in milk. So it's great that Uruguay could grow. It's great they could export, but 5 billion pounds isn't a lot of milk. So China, what did I put on the map of China? I put some deserts on there. China is 27% desert. I don't know if any of you knew that. I did not. I learned that in doing this presentation. And the Gobi Desert is a big part of China. It's also in Mongolia. The Gobi Desert is the fastest growing desert in the world. It's growing at a rate of about 2 miles per year. Most of the dairy farms in China are located in the north, in here. They're located in, like, I have the provinces of Inner Mongolia, which is like right here, Hebei, and then Heilongjiang. They're all in the north though, and it's pretty deserty there. So there's some limitations. With that said, the Chinese government is extremely supportive of modernizing their dairy sector. And what they've done in their dairy sector since the melamine scandal is just, to me, it's unreal. So in 1949, when China became a country, they made about 120,000 metric tons of milk per year. By 1980, so what is that, 30 years later, they were up to 1.2 million metric tons. The government's goal by 2025 is to make 45 million metric tons of milk. So from 1980 at 1.2 million to 2025 to 45 million metric tons over, what is that, a 45-year period. Okay, so I don't know if you guys are good with the metric system. I'm not. To put that into pounds, it's about 100 billion pounds of milk. That's their goal by 2025. So how do you do that? How do you go from 1.2 million metric tons in 1980 to 45 million metric tons? You start adding large, very large Western dairies. I'm going to show you a picture of one here in a second. But just to give you some background on how rapidly things have changed in doing my research for this presentation, about half the cows in China were still milked by hand in 2008. So when the melamine scandal occurred, that's not the case today. And then before 2008, 70% of farms had 20 cows or less. In 2014, that number had dropped to 43%. With farms of 1,000 cows making up 20% of farms in China. Unfortunately, I don't have more up-to-date numbers than that, but I think the takeaway is the Chinese are they're completely changing their dairy infrastructure. 2008 is 13 years ago, and they've done it. I mean, can you imagine in 13 years if we completely redid our dairy industry? Through their government support, they have done that. And they're going to run into some limitations, even if the government is supportive. You cannot, to date, humankind has not turned desert land back into agricultural land. So if they continue to farm in the desert, they could just run into water restrictions. And the other issue that the Chinese likely will run into is just growing the crops. You need a lot of crops to feed cows. Right now, they import feed. So even if they want to be solely self-sufficient, it's going to be very hard, even if the government's supportive, because they're farming in the desert, they have water availability and land availability issues. How are they going to grow all the crops? So somehow or another, they're going to be relying on others, at least as it sits today. I want to show you a picture here, of a dairy farm in China. That's the website it's from, but this is part of, it's a company called Modern Dairies. They milk 100,000 cows across 17 sites in China. And you can see this looks very, very westernized, doesn't it? They have rotary parlors. They follow the same protocols that you would follow on your dairy farm. I watched like a clip from a Chinese news station, and she walked through the inside of the barn. I mean, it was like being on a farm here in the States. So this has been the approach to upping milk production in China. And we're going to talk about consumption in the next section here. So I'll talk about Chinese consumption. But yeah, it's rapidly growing in China. And we're going to talk about consumption next. So what markets, when you think about countries or markets, what markets do you anticipate, this is a question for the chat, do you anticipate hold the most growth potential in the future? And I will look at the chat and see if, oh, I got a response. Thank you. Yeah, dairy protein, for sure. Bernie says that. Yeah, for sure. And milk is hard to move too. It's liquid, so just continuing to see powders and things move. Anybody have ideas on what parts of the world might consume more dairy? We'll let you think on that a little bit, and we'll just keep moving. The growth in, oh, thank you, Mexico, US, yes, I think so, but other places too. So growth in dairy is primarily going to occur in the developing world. So you can see all the places. I put stars, Africa, India, which we talked about a little bit, Southeast Asia, and China. So as it sits today, there's about 8 billion people in the world, and population is growing at 1.1% per year. It is slowing down, but 1.1% of 7.8 billion is 86 million people. And I know this presentation has a ton of numbers. I like numbers, so I hope I'm not overwhelming you. To put it in context, with all these numbers, I'm trying to put them in context. 86 million people, that's about a quarter of the United States population. So every year right now, to the world, a quarter of the United States population is being added. And by 2050, the UN estimates that world population will be about 9.7 billion people. And then they think it might start to level off. The interesting thing in doing this, in learning a little bit more about this, was I knew birth rates were declining, like in Europe and Japan and the United States. The UN does not, we're like not even factored into this 2 billion more people that are going to exist in the next 30 years. Most of the growth is going to come in Africa and some in Asia, but like the rest of the world, they don't really expect us to grow. We'll keep up with mortality or even decline. So that's why these markets where the stars are, that's why the stars are there. This isn't just my opinion, OECD, FAO, IFCN, all these places. This is why they're saying these are the areas that are gonna grow, because the people will be there. That doesn't mean that dairy consumption can't grow here in the United States. I thought this was really interesting. What I read was like dairy consumption is not really going to increase in the Western world. And then I read this. In 2018, Americans consumed 619 pounds of dairy. However, it's forecasted that Americans will consume 679 pounds of dairy by 2040. So that's a 60-pound increase over, 20 years. So we're still, I was like, that's really interesting, because for 300 million people to each consume 60 more pounds of dairy, and it'll probably be through like cheese and yogurt and higher value products. To me, that's not, there's no increase. That's, to me, that's sizable. But maybe the telling part of that is that it's going to grow even more in the rest of the world. So sure, we'll consume more here in higher value products, but it's going to grow even more in the rest of the world. So Africa, Southeast Asia, we talked about India, that India will fill its own pipeline, and then China. I'm going to mostly talk about China here because that's really, really the big one. There's all roads lead to China. So there's 1.4 billion people in China today. And if you think about history, the Chinese have not been big consumers of dairy. But that has started to really change in the last 40 years. In 1980, the average China person in China ate about 4 kilograms of dairy. So that's, 8 to 10 pounds, we'll say. And by 2005, that had quadrupled, over quadrupled. It was at 18 kilograms. So, you know, that's around 40 pounds, we'll say 40 pounds per person. In 2000, though, what happened, like what drove some of that is the Chinese government, they were getting this idea that dairy promotes health, and that they understood the research that shows if children consume animal fats, they're less likely to have growth stunting. So they were encouraging the consumption of dairy, and they did this in a couple ways. One way was by making a goal to give every child like a glass of milk at school each day. And they started in the inner cities, and then they spread it out to the rural areas. And then the other thing they did was they got the healthcare field on board. So when parents took their children in to be vaccinated, for example, the nurses and doctors, clinic workers told them you should give your children dairy. And what they find too is a lot of Chinese people are lactose intolerant, but the babies aren't. When the babies have the lactase enzyme to digest milk, and if you continue to consume milk, the enzyme is more likely to stick around, or your body is more likely to continue to make it. So in a lot of families, you'll see the grandparents and the parents don't consume dairy, but because the parents were told to give it to their children and that it's healthy, the children consume it and they seem to be able to handle it. So today, that brings us to today. Today, the average person in China consumes around 35 kilograms of dairy per year, which is 77 pounds. That sounds like a big jump, right? I was saying in 1980, it was 4 kilograms. It is a big jump, but 77 pounds or 35 kilograms is the same thing as about half a cup of milk a day, about 4 ounces of milk. So it's really not that much that they're even consuming. They have scale, right? There's 1.4 billion people. So if 1.4 billion people, consume half a cup of milk per day, that's around 100 billion pounds of milk per year that's needed. Now here's the crazy part. Remember I said China's government wanted to increase milk production? Well, why is that? Because they want people to eat more dairy, and they actually want people to triple their dairy consumption. And so if they triple their dairy consumption, right, if they're consuming around 100 billion pounds of milk right now per year, and they triple it, that means it's going to go to 300 billion pounds. And that means they need 200 billion more pounds of milk. So there's a lot of potential for growth, right? And I do not think China, just given their geography, given some of sure the government's supportive, but like Mother Nature is Mother Nature. If you don't have water, there's nothing that can really be done about that, especially if you want to be self-sufficient. China is going to need other sources to fill this pipeline. And I think the United States plays a critical role in providing dairy commodities to China. So you might be thinking, this all sounds great. So now we've talked about demand, we've talked about growth. Actually, IFCN, International Farm Comparison Network, says that we have more milk today than what's demanded. But at some point in the future, they actually expect it's going to reverse, and that we will have more demand than supply. That's just one economic group's opinion. But I think it's really fascinating that's what they're seeing. And just given some of these goals, especially in a place like China, it seems plausible. So with that, what could possibly go wrong, right? Everything looks great. We can grow in the US, globally, export markets are increasing. So what could possibly go wrong? Consumption could be threatened through a bunch of different things. This is kind of a busy slide. But you can see, at the top here, we have there's a lot of environmental concerns about dairy right now, along with animal welfare. Those things, that could cause consumers to drink less milk. That's fair. We just saw what happens when we have a global pandemic. That can cause consumption to go down, primarily just due to poor economic growth. But really, poor economic growth can happen at any point in time. Could be due to a virus or anything else, but those things all can cause a decrease in consumption. These other like new foods we see, plant-based drinks, or even like lab-based meat, people could start consuming those. What I like, this one comes up a lot actually, and I already got a question in the chat about it, but what I can tell you about those markets today is that they're very small. They get a lot of press and people talk a lot about them. They're very small. I think it's wise to watch them, but they're not. I think most consumers honestly realize like it's not milk, and that there are other opportunities too for dairy producers to sell their product outside of just liquid drinking milk through these value-added products like cheese or yogurt or ice cream, butter. Those are all viewed favorably. I absolutely think these are trends to keep an eye on, but as it sits today, they're very, very small parts of the market. The last thing I want to highlight here is just food security too. So historically, China, Algeria, they have stockpiled, like filled their coffers so that they would have supplies of food for their citizens. It's possible, like especially now that we've gone through the pandemic and experienced food shortages a little bit in the Western world, that we could see more of this from countries that are typically exporters of ag products, that they just export less and hang on to it to keep it in their coffers. That's possible, but then that would limit the growth in other markets, in other countries. So those are some things that could happen. With that being said though, what does that all mean for people here, dairy farmers here in central Minnesota? Dairy is a healthy food and consumers want healthy foods. Anytime I've listened to a consumer panel, that's what comes up. Dairy has a health halo to it, especially right now. You create a healthy product. That is a wonderful selling point. Another good selling point, I have this is supposed to be like local foods, right? Consumers want to know where their food comes from. Like right now, you're starting to see QR codes, UPC codes on the back of foods, and you can see the traceability of the food. I don't see that trend going away. I think consumers are going to continue to want to know where their food comes from and to understand that it is local, that it's from a family farm. That's a story you all have to tell. Most farms in the US, it's well over 90% are family owned. And consumers want to hear that. So I think telling that story of like, we're local, we're family owned, and we take good care of our cows. I know not everybody grazes, but it's a nice picture as we think about like quality of product. Consumers want to know where their food comes from, and they want to know that it's quality. You produce a quality product, you know that, and it's a healthy product. Consumers want to hear that. I think you have a wonderful story to tell. So I have these two logos here. In the last week or two, AMPI and First District announced that they're going to be doing some joint marketing, this new organization that they're forming. Marketing is going to be very important in the future. It always has been, but as I was working on this presentation, one of the thoughts that I had was, you have a great story to tell, right? It's local, it's family owned, it is a quality product, it's a healthy product too. Now more than ever, it's critical that the co-ops and the dairy checkoff, these are the messages that they're conveying, messages that will appeal to consumers. And I understand that dairy farmers are just individuals, right? You're not the one making the marketing decisions. Your takeaway would be, it's critical that you influence and that you share. These are the messages that are working, that other companies are having success with. So I would even encourage you as dairy farmers, like look around when, you get the Sunday paper and you're going through the ads, or you're watching TV or at the grocery store. How are other food companies marketing their product? What is it that they're doing? Are they using social media? Is it in-store sampling? And what are the messages what do you notice when you look at, their ads? Is it, like family? Is it health? What is it? Because those are the things that as a dairy industry, we want to communicate. You want to market your product in a modern way, if that makes sense, in a way that's going to appeal to consumers. So whether that's through the checkoff or your co-ops, communicating these messages and communicating them in such a way that they make sense to consumers and grab consumers is going to be very critical. And I think honestly, that is what will stave off the plant-based alternatives or the lab-based meat. You have a really good story if you can get the story told in an effective way, in a really agile and modern way. people will continue to consume dairy. You have nothing to worry about. I have this logo of Fairlife here. So think about Fairlife. That is a completely new product offering, or even Greek yogurt. Like, 10, 15 years ago, Greek yogurt wasn't a thing. Innovation is important too. That's part of modernizing an industry. You got to be innovative. So are there new product offerings or new occasions that dairy can be used for? There was never a space for a no lactose, high protein product in the dairy case until somebody made it, and consumers are like, I like it. Now there's lots of space, right, for this Fairlife product. So I think innovation is going to be really critical too. Consumers are aware that, you can drink milk and eat cheese. Are there other ways we can process milk to make it into another healthful product? And then the last thing I'm going to say here, I'm checking the time too. Oh, I talked a lot. I will take questions. So I have the piggy bank. You have to know your numbers. In every generation, like my maternal grandfather, he milked cows by hand. My dad, he had milking machines. My brothers, my cousins, they milk with robots. In every generation, you have to get better. Things get more competitive. You have to change in order to stay competitive. That doesn't mean you have to get bigger, but you may need to simply make changes. You got to know your numbers and be willing to be agile. So with that, we talked today about future. Dairy production is going to continue to grow. Great opportunities here in the U.S. for that. Consumption will continue to grow and may even outstrip production. That's an opportunity for the United States for exports. And what can you do about it here in central Minnesota? Market your product well, be innovative, influence the decision makers so that your message does get out there. I am trying to look, are there questions? I'll take a breath, I said a lot. Any questions? I'm looking over the chat too, Bernie. I don't know if you saw anything that came in. I don't have a ton to say on milk price, if I'm totally honest. Sorry, Chris. For this year, I am a market analyst, so I can give you something really quick. Right now it does seem like China's buying really strongly. There's a lot of milk though out there. The last time I really ran numbers in January, there was more milk than demand. However, China is notorious for buying a lot when prices are low. US prices have been at a pretty big discount to the rest of the world. So, I think this year where we're seeing, I don't see anything drastically changing the direction that we're on right now, but all that is to say, think about Marin's talk. If you saw that earlier, what he said on January 21st and then what happened, you never know when a drought in New Zealand or, a worldwide pandemic might throw everything off the mark. What I like to tell dairy farmers is pick a forecast, USDA, Blimling, whomever, pick a forecast and make a plan against that, and then have your dial back in point. So every, 30 days, you're going to check in and see if the risk management plan still makes sense. Because forecasts do change. I think they're helpful. Even though they change, they help you to make a plan. And then when you stay on top of them, you can update them accordingly. But other questions?
I'm not seeing any on my end here, Betty, but thank you very much for your insights, especially a global view. And I think it's also, like you mentioned, it's very important to stay informed. Just as consumers, we want to know the whole story. And so how important it is for our dairy producers also to know the whole story and be able to share that, because I'd like you said too, I believe that our consumers want to know and want to support our local producers in a way that is sustainable and also producing good food. So Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, everybody, and thank you.